background noise? Okay, we're not hearing anything then coming out of there. Okay, great, perfect. All right, so I'll dive in. Thank you so much for the introduction and thank you for having me today. I will first start out by introducing the audience to our agency, the agency that I work for, the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, or we call ourselves Mass Wildlife for short. We're one of 4 divisions within the Department of Fish and Game, and we're the only state agency that has the statutory responsibility to conserve, that is, restoring, protecting, and managing all of the native flora and fauna here in Massachusetts. And our responsibility spans from everything from managing moose to rare moth species to essentially everything in between, with the exception of marine species. And we do this work to ensure that these natural resources are thriving on our landscape and so that they're available for people to utilize and enjoy. Where can you find us in the state? We have 5 district offices across Massachusetts. Our Western District office is in Dalton, our Valley District office in Belchertown, our Central District office is in West Boylston, Northeast is in Ayer, Southeast is in Bourne, and then we have our field headquarters located in Westboro. We also have 5 fish hatcheries across the state in Montague, Sunderland, Belchertown, and Palmer and Sandwich, excuse me. So one of the key points that I wanted to touch on today is the funding for our agency. So unlike most state agencies, Mass Wildlife is different in that we don't function on your state tax dollars, basically. So we receive a very small portion of those general funds. The majority of our funding comes from the sale of hunting, fishing, and trapping licenses, permits, and stamps, as well as allocated federal excise taxes on hunting and fishing equipment. We also receive a fair amount of donations and grant money, but it's important to recognize that the revenue that's gained through the sale of hunting and fishing and trapping licenses, permits, and stamps is not used just to manage those game species that sportsmen are pursuing. That those funds are also used to purchase conservation land, to conduct habitat management on those properties, and to conserve a much wider array of non-game species, those threatened and endangered species, and the whole slew of other species that are maybe common and abundant but are not game species. So today I'm here to talk really about the role of deer hunting in wildlife conservation. And a critical takeaway here is this funding component. Deer are our most common game species. They're the species that most people who participate in hunting are pursuing. And so that means that a fair bit of the revenue that's coming from the sale of licenses and permits for deer hunting is again contributing to land acquisition, habitat management, and conservation of all wildlife species. Just a little bit about a little more background on our agency. I was just going to run through the major sections of our agency and what our staff do. So we have a group of staff members who are devoted to our forestry and habitat management program. Our agency owns about almost 240,000 acres across the Commonwealth. And so these staff members are largely focusing on restoring and managing critical habitats on those properties. We have another quite large section of our agency, a pretty small agency, about 150 employees total. So we're a pretty small group of folks, but a good chunk of those folks, maybe a quarter to a third of those individuals work for our Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. And those biologists are responsible for the conservation, protection, and management of the most vulnerable plant and animal species here in the Commonwealth. So those animals that are threatened, endangered, and species of special concern. We have a whole section devoted to outreach and education, and those folks are doing things like outdoor skills clinics, wildlife workshops for educators, giving various presentations. They're responsible for all of our publications like our Mass Wildlife Magazine, our annual hunting and fishing guide, and they also manage all of our web content and our social media platforms. We have another section that's devoted to freshwater fisheries management. So these folks are conducting research and collecting management. They're doing things like electroshocking streams, rivers, ponds, lakes to determine fish populations, population health, and they're also monitoring sensitive areas like cold water fisheries resources. And then we have our wildlife section. The wildlife section, similar to the freshwater fisheries section, but on the wildlife side of things. And the vast majority of the work that we do is with game species, so those species that can be hunted and trapped. So a couple examples here, our black bear research project, where we're actively collaring and monitoring female black bears across the state. Another example is our waterfowl banding program. And then a very few number of projects that we do within the wildlife section work with non-game species. So an example here is the bald eagle program. But again, vast majority of what we're doing in the wildlife program is working with those species that can be hunted and trapped. That brings us to me and how I fit into all of this. I work within the wildlife section. I work as, I usually introduce myself as a general wildlife biologist. And that's because I work under our game species project leaders. So we have a deer and moose project leader. We have a black bear and fur bearer project leader. We have wild turkey and upland game project leader. And then we also have a position for a waterfowl biologist who retired over the summer after a very long career. So that position is currently vacant, but should be backfilled at some point. So my job is to work under those project leaders and support them in essentially every aspect of what they do. So I typically have some mix of field work, but the majority of what I do is behind a computer. And that's because much of the work that I do relates back to the collection and management of data for those game species. So a lot of it has to do with harvest reporting data, population monitoring, and a good bulk of what I do, my wheelhouse is kind of within the survey world, conducting annual hunter surveys, annual trapper surveys, and utilizing that information for us to better understand and manage those game species. A fair bit of what I do also involves responding to public inquiries regarding human-wildlife interactions and just general wildlife management, answering those kinds of general questions. But the lion's share of that work is done by Megan Crawford, who's also here with us today, and she's helping to facilitate the Zoom aspect of this. So a huge shout out to her, a huge thank you to help in her help in managing that aspect of it. She works also in our wildlife section as the community engagement biologist, and much of what she's doing is working to build trust and relationships with the public, developing educational materials, conducting outreach efforts, and again, the lion's share of responding to those public inquiries about wildlife interactions, human-wildlife conflict, and wildlife management. So Carl already mentioned we're going to save questions to the end, but again, if there's, when we do get to the end there, if there's anything that I can't answer that Megan might be able to answer, I might call on her to help with that, but I'll dive into the topic that we're here to discuss today, which is deer and deer management here in Massachusetts. So thanks to successful wildlife conservation efforts over the years, which I'll talk a little bit about more later, deer are now a very common, very abundant species here in Massachusetts. They're what we consider habitat generalists, which means they can make a living just about anywhere. They can use all different types of wildlife habitat, and they actually do really, really well and often select to be in more suburban environments because it provides really excellent habitat for them. A lot of what we call edge habitat, which provides all of the food, the cover, the space that they need to survive. And so they're finding this high quality, ample habitat throughout the Commonwealth, especially in developed landscapes and in those locations and basically anywhere. Deer, again, they're just really good at surviving. So they have very high survival rates, they have high reproductive rates, and they have low mortality rates. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that mortality rates in terms of adult deer are low, largely because we no longer have our native large predators here. So historically, we had mountain lions and we had gray wolves, and those two predators worked to keep deer populations in check because they were the primary mortality factor for adult deer. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you're talking to, since European colonization, those animals became extirpated mid-1800s or so. And so those predators no longer exist here on the landscape. They're no longer serving that function as the top predator, and that contributes to deer populations rising. So what we're left with are just human-associated factors, human-associated mortality factors for adult deer. That includes regulated hunting and, unfortunately, deer vehicle collisions as being the primary forms of mortality for adult deer. A little bit about deer diet. So these animals are classified as herbivores and ruminants, meaning that the vast majority of their diet is comprised of plant material. In the spring and the summer, the growing season, they're focused on eating new growth. So buds, leaves, flowers, they're eating a lot of forbs as well. In the fall, their digestive system shifts and their feeding behavior shifts considerably. So at that point, they're focused mostly on hard mast. So think acorns, hickory nuts, beech nuts, any other kind of hard mast that's available, and soft mast, things like fruits. So think apples, common food source in the fall. And then they shift even more dramatically into the winter months when those food sources become more difficult to find, and they focus on woody browse. So things like twigs and tree bark, things that are incredibly difficult to digest, and that's why their digestive system shifts considerably during the winter to accommodate those food sources. In a few more slides, I'll talk about what the consumption of these food sources mean for the ecosystem. So this is a very basic slide here, just some basic terminology about deer. I'm sure you're all aware that we refer to female deer as does and male deer as bucks and young of the year as fawns. But later on, I'll be using the terms antlered and antlerless frequently. And so I just wanted to familiarize you with those terms. So antlered deer are deer with antlers, which vast majority of the time we're talking about adult male deer. It's a very, very small percentage of female deer that can grow antlers. But really, when we say antler deer, we're talking about adult males or bucks. Antlerless, we're talking about deer that do not have antlers, and the vast majority of those are going to be female deer. So basically all female deer, regardless of their age class, are going to be without antlers, plus male fawns or young of the year who have not yet grown antlers. Those are going to be referred to as button bucks sometimes, but they fall within that antlerless category. So later on in the talk, whenever I mention antlerless deer, just think female deer. A little bit more about just basic deer biology. So female deer, as I was talking about in that last slide, or antlerless deer, they really are the drivers of the population because they are the ones who are producing fawns. You can think of male deer as a single animal on the landscape at any given time year over year. But a female deer you can think of as more like 4 deer on the landscape because you have that adult female doe, plus you have the fawns that she's going to produce that year. Deer start to reproduce pretty early on in life. So at just 2 years old, they're having their first fawn. Usually that first year, they're just having 1 fawn. But after that, they're having 2 or even 3 fawns every single year. They're giving birth to those typically late May to early July. That fawning window can be a little bit wider, but here in the Northeast, that's pretty much the time when fawns are dropping. And research in surrounding states have shown that fawns have really high survival rates, really no matter what type of habitat they're in, certainly in suburban areas where there's quite a bit of high quality habitat, but just across the board, fawn survival is really high. So it's anywhere between 40 and 60%. So you can think on average, if every doe is having 2 fawns a year, at least one of those is surviving to adulthood. The other important thing here is talking about home range. So we look at deer and we think of them as a large-bodied animal, but for a large animal, they actually maintain a really small home range. So anywhere from a half a square mile to 3 square miles. So males are going to have a larger home range than females, certainly during the breeding season. But females especially maintain a really small home range. And what that means is that these animals can live at high densities. So in short, deer are prolific breeders. They breed early in life. They breed every year continuously throughout their lives. They produce multiple fawns every year that have very high survival rates, and they're maintaining these small home ranges, which means these animals can live at really high densities on the landscape. And very generally, what this means is that given deer are a really adaptable species, habitat generalists that are really good at surviving, really good at reproducing, really good at living at high densities, and without that necessary natural mortality taking place, your deer densities and deer populations are just going to continue to grow over time. And this brings us to the concept of deer overabundance, meaning that the deer population has exceeded the management goals set by biologists. And moreover, this means that deer are exceeding what we call ecological carrying capacity and often cultural carrying capacity. Ecological carrying capacity is essentially the number of deer that the landscape, that the ecosystem can support and remain healthy. Cultural carrying capacity is a little bit more complicated in that it's essentially the number of deer that people are willing to tolerate. And as you can imagine, that varies wildly depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a deer hunter, that density is going to be pretty high. If you're talking to someone who has, prized hostas that are chomped down by deer every day, they might say 0 deer is what I can tolerate, right? And so cultural carrying capacity is a difficult concept to kind of wrap our heads around, but it's also exceedingly difficult to quantify in any way. So really, I'm going to be focused more on that ecological carrying capacity. Before diving into that, I'll just touch on what I'm sure all of you are already familiar with. When we're talking about the exceedance of cultural carrying capacity, we know that there are some significant societal impacts that result when deer are overabundant. So one of those things is increased deer vehicle collisions. Those have been on the rise here in Massachusetts over the years, continue to increase. Those are particularly common in busy landscapes where there's high road density. And it's estimated by insurance companies that about 1 in every 115 Massachusetts drivers experience a deer vehicle collision every single year. So these are really common. It's also important, unfortunately, but important to point out that there are a lot of human injuries that result from those deer vehicle collisions. And we'll get into later on talking about hunting, talking about the safety of hunting. But we oftentimes hear from members of the public who are unfamiliar with hunting concerns about safety. And I would push back and say that, and I'll get into this a lot about how safe hunting is for both hunters and non-hunters alike. If you're concerned about deer and concerned about any aspect of your safety, deer vehicle collisions and tick-borne illnesses are things that are much more worth your while in terms of being worried about. So another piece here, tick-borne illnesses. There's not a clear, linear, super direct connection between tick-borne illnesses and deer densities, but they're inextricably tied. So deer densities definitely drive tick densities, especially black-legged ticks and lone star ticks that utilize deer as their primary host. And so there is unquestionably a connection between high deer densities, high tick densities, and high instances of tick-borne illnesses. We also know that we suffer significant agricultural losses where deer are overabundant, and then there's also damage to ornamental plantings and gardens as well. So I mentioned we're going to get more into those ecological impacts and how deer exceed ecological carrying capacity. And so that's what we're really here to focus on today, and then tying in what deer hunting means for wildlife conservation as a whole. So I mentioned earlier about what deer eat. They're eating a lot of vegetation, right? But it's not just the ecological damage piece isn't just about the fact that deer consume vegetation. It's how they consume and how much they consume. So deer are different from herbivores that we consider to be grazers. Deer are actually what we call browsers. And what that means is they're very selective in how they feed. So they will pick and choose food that tastes better and that's more nutritious. And so again, during the growing season, they're going to be focused on those new shoots, new buds, flowers. So when those plants are most vulnerable and trying to grow and trying to reproduce, that's when deer are going to find them the tastiest and the most nutritious. And they really tend to hammer those species, especially the ones that taste good to them and that are nutritious. So it's a lot about how they're consuming food. They're also preferring oftentimes native plant species over invasive plant species. So they're eating a lot more of those native plant species, giving those invasive plant species a leg up and an advantage, particularly during the growing season. And another thing to keep in mind here, I mentioned deer are a pretty large-bodied animal, and they need to consume about 6 to 8% of their total body weight in vegetation every single day to sustain themselves. So when we're talking about a deer that, 100, 150 pounds in that range, we're talking somewhere about 7 to 12 pounds of vegetation that every individual deer needs to consume every single day. So they're consuming a huge amount of vegetation, a lot of it during the growing season when plants are trying to reproduce and trying to sustain themselves. And they're very selective in how they choose those food sources. So this brings us to this issue of the ecological impacts of deer overabundance. There are numerous research efforts that have demonstrated that healthy ecosystems cannot support more than about 18 deer per square mile. And at and above that density, we start to see significant negative impacts to the ecosystem. So you see a decrease in overall plant species diversity and age class diversity. You typically see an increase in invasive plants. You see a decrease in forest regeneration, again, because those seedlings, those saplings can't grow up during the growing season. They can't get a head start, basically, before being eaten by deer. So you have a very much reduced understory and oftentimes little to no ground cover. And that results in things like soil erosion, siltation, reduced water quality. And overall, you get this degradation of wildlife habitat. So there are lots of different species of wildlife and plants and insects that need to utilize and depend on a healthy ecosystem in addition to deer, right? And when the habitat is severely degraded, all of those species suffer as a result. And we tend to see a reduction in overall biodiversity. So species like ground nesting or intermediate canopy nesting songbird species are particularly vulnerable. A lot of insect species are quite vulnerable. I've already talked a bit about like flowering plants. Are some of the threatened and endangered species, especially species that are very habitat specific. So a good example is the endangered Carner blue butterfly is a species that is dependent upon lupin. And lupin is a flower that deer will regularly consume. So when deer consume all of the lupin, that butterfly species no longer has the host species that it depends on to complete its life cycle. So you have these wide-ranging impacts that affect the entire ecosystem and the entire food web. So when deer become overabundant, you end up getting forests that look something like this. And you can tell from this photo, this was taken early spring, the canopy is just starting to leaf out. But what I'd like you to focus on is the fact that basically all of the trees in this picture are essentially the same diameter, same size. So they're all about the same age, right? And there's essentially nothing in the understory. You don't see any pole timber, you don't see any saplings, you can't really see any seedlings in here, but you can see these blobs of bright green. And all of that bright green that you're seeing there is Japanese barberry, which is an invasive species. And it's also a species that is highly correlated with high black-legged tick densities. It's actually a species that really bolsters tick populations because it provides a really great microclimate, nice humid microclimate that ticks need. So this is an example of what a forest looks like when deer become overabundant. I also want to just point out the next couple of slides. I'll have a few more examples, but an important take home here is that forests don't get to this point only because of deer overabundance. It's a combination of deer overabundance and lack of active habitat management. So habitat management is an important component too. And by that, I mean forestry practices like cutting trees and brush hogging and creating openings in the forest. That's a really important component too. So while deer play a really important role in degrading forest ecosystems, they're not the only piece of the puzzle. Here's another example. This property is out in Western Massachusetts. I think it was East Hampton or Northampton. It's a Mass Audubon property that was closed to hunting for a very long time. And I think it's actually open to some level of regulated hunting now. But this is a good example in that many people might look at this and think it's okay. There's a lot of green in this photo and green is good, right? But again, what you see is mostly this kind of even-aged forest, and you see essentially nothing in the understory. You see a couple of little white pine seedlings in the foreground. White pine are a species that deer don't prefer to eat. And then the ground cover basically is just this monoculture of hay-scented fern. So not an example of a healthy and diverse ecosystem here. And the third example, this is in this picture, you can see a little bit more diversity in terms of age class and maybe species diversity. But again, there's essentially nothing for understory. There's no ground cover. You see this little maple stump sprout in the foreground. If we zoomed in on that, we'd see that it was heavily browsed by deer because that is a preferred species. But basically, the takeaway here is that a lot of folks might look at this and think, it's okay. It's a forest. That's what a forest should look like. And for a lot of people, this is the only type of forest they've really ever seen. And so they think this is perfectly fine. This is healthy. This is what it should look like. But someone with a trained eye, someone who's an ecologist or a botanist or a wildlife biologist, even an ornithologist or an entomologist might look at this and recognize the warning signs here that we have some issues going on. And another important point that I want to make, these last three photos that I've shared are photos that were taken by biologists who were conducting vegetation surveys on these properties. And these photos aren't just a picture of one location on that property. These photos served to represent what those properties looked like generally on a whole. So after we completed the vegetation survey by traversing most of the parcel or that property, these photos were photos that represented what that property generally looked like across the board. So not every corner of the property looked like this, but most of it did. While this isn't really applicable here in our neck of the woods where we are today, it is important to note that deer, again, as habitat generalists, they're living just about anywhere. They're also using coastal habitats where they have significant impacts. So not just in terms of what they're eating in those ecosystems, but their travel patterns. So they're using well-worn trails daily, and in loose sandy soils, that creates some significant erosion issues, and in salt marsh habitats, it can actually result in some pretty significant hydrological issues as well. So this concept of deer overabundance, it brings us to the importance of deer management, right? So we all now have an understanding of when carrying capacity is exceeded, that we know that the other plants, animals, insects that depend upon a healthy and diverse ecosystem are negatively impacted, that there are these cascading effects that impact every aspect of the food web. And this highlights the importance of us having and maintaining a deer density goal of about 12 to 18 deer per square mile. But it's really important for folks to understand that it's easy for us to say that deer density should be at 12 to 18 deer per square mile. It's another thing to actually get deer densities to 12 to 18 deer per square mile and to maintain them at that density over time. So what I want to highlight here is that deer management is really, really complicated. So we'll often hear from people, it's just as simple as just open, the land to hunting and that'll knock the numbers down. Deer management is complicated. And so there's no one simple, quick, easy, painless way that we're going to get to these deer densities. It's something that takes a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of effort, and a lot of collaboration and work among partners and landowners to achieve those goals. So before I dive into the more modern approach to deer management, I'll give just really a quick overview of the history of deer management in Massachusetts. So declines began as soon as European colonization started. Deer started to disappear from the landscape, especially with market hunting. Massachusetts had the first deer season closure in the mid 1700s. They recognized that deer were disappearing, and so they were telling people you can't kill any more deer because we're not going to have any more ever. By 1800, there were estimated to be fewer than 1,000 deer in the Commonwealth. And then 1866, the Division of Fisheries and Game was established. A few years later, they started passing laws and regulations requiring licenses and tags for the hunting of deer. Until 1910, hunters were restricted to taking bucks only or antlered deer only, again, because females drive the population. And so they wanted to ensure that there were more females on the landscape to reproduce, to bolster that deer population. That absolutely worked. And so by the 1960s or so, it was recognized we've got deer back, we've got enough deer where we can start allowing hunters to harvest some of those antlerless deer. And that's where the antlerless deer permit system was created. And then by early 1980s, we have the modern permit allocation system and the modeling that we currently use. So on this slide, I'll talk about how we go about managing deer in Massachusetts today and monitoring those populations. So today we manage deer across 15 wildlife management zones that you can see depicted in this map here. So these management zones are obviously larger than the town. We don't manage on the town level. We manage on these management area level, which is much larger and much more suitable when we're talking about the statistical aspects of utilizing data and plugging data into a population model. So essentially what we're doing is we're using data from the deer hunting season to estimate deer densities. We use what's called a population reconstruction model, and we take the data from the hunting season. So when people are hunting deer, they're required to report those animals, the town that they're harvested in, the sex of the animal, and additional information has to be reported to our agency. During the first week of the shotgun season, we also collect biological data. So we're collecting age of the animal, we're collecting antler beam diameters and antler measurements. And all of that information is fed into this population reconstruction model that we utilize to estimate deer densities. The important take home here, though, is that these densities, and you can see the different colors on the map represent kind of where that zone stands in terms of how we estimate the density. The important take home here is that all the data that's fed into that model is coming from properties that are open to hunting. So it doesn't tell us anything about those properties that are closed to hunting access. And so while we might say like, okay, zone 2, it's green, it's in that goal range of 12 to 18 deer per square mile, that's on the properties that are open to regulated hunting. But for any properties that are closed to regulated hunting, we can go ahead and assume that deer densities are actually quite a bit higher than what we estimate here. So again, where we're managing deer by removing female deer, right? Because they're the drivers of the population. And we do that through an antlerless deer permit allocation system. So based upon the harvest data that we get and the density estimate for that particular zone, we'll then allocate a certain number of antlerless deer permits to allow hunters to harvest X number of female deer that will then help keep us within or get us closer toward that management goal. So why hunting? I keep talking about hunting as the management tool that we're utilizing. We know from lots of research efforts and lots of efforts across the nation that hunting is the only method for deer population management that is effective, that's permissible, that's practical. Every state in the country relies on regulated hunting to manage deer, and hunting has an incredible safety record, both nationally and especially here in Massachusetts. So regulated hunting is effective at reducing deer densities when it's adequately implemented. It results in the immediate removal of deer from the landscape, and it's extremely safe, it's socially beneficial, and it's fiscally responsible. We often get the question from the public about whether or not there are any non-lethal options. Are there any way that we can manage deer without having to kill them? And the reality is that in contrast to regulated hunting, we know that these non-lethal alternative attempts, things like chemical immobilization, surgical sterilization, are just they've just been shown to be ineffective. They do not significantly reduce high deer numbers. They do not immediately remove deer from the landscape. They're wildly impractical, and they're extremely, extremely expensive. So back to hunting. If you or your family members or friends are still kind of feeling unsure about hunting and uncomfortable with the concept of hunting, it could be because you or those folks are just unfamiliar with hunting and hunting culture. And so Mass Wildlife has created some really helpful resources on our website that you can find. We've got a webpage about frequently asked questions about hunting that's intended for the non-hunting community. And we have another webpage that talks about all of the benefits of hunting here in Massachusetts. So that'll talk through things like why people hunt, the motivations for hunting, how safe it is, and how you can safely enjoy the outdoors while people are hunting the same parcel that you're recreating on, how highly regulated hunting is and how those rules are strictly enforced by law enforcement, what kind of training hunters need to go through to complete their hunter safety courses in order to even qualify for a hunting license. And again, those benefits, the many benefits of hunting, how it benefits the environment and benefits people alike. And we found that one really effective strategy for communicating with the public, especially the non-hunting public, about the importance of hunting is to talk about how venison is utilized as a food source. And not only is venison used to feed families of hunters themselves, but it's also used and donated and utilized to help share with people who are in need. And so thanks to our new-ish Mass Wildlife's Hunter Share the Harvest program, we have a really great opportunity to share venison with more people. So this program was launched in 2022. We currently have 18 processors that participate statewide, 25 or more distributors statewide, and about 95,000 plus meals that have been donated to date just this year. About 52,000 meals were donated through the program. And so while when communicating about hunting and the importance of hunting, oftentimes we find that sort of like ecological damage messaging doesn't really resonate with some people, but hungry people and people in need does resonate with a lot of folks. So this program is a really great way to help communicate to that non-hunting constituency about the importance of hunting and what kind of benefits can come from regulated hunting of deer. So it provides us with another way to talk about hunting in a positive light that people can find more relatable and justifiable. Just a little bit more in the program. Hunters can donate an entire deer. They can donate partial deer. And they do that by bringing it to one of those participating processors. Those processors are paid full service rates. Partial donations get subsidized with discounts for hunters. This, again, great outlet for donating venison. So we see in the literature that hunters, one of the main motivating factors for deer hunters is to acquire venison and to feed themselves and to feed their families. But the science has shown that hunters oftentimes will harvest about 2 deer per year because that's all they need to feed themselves and to feed their families and to fill their freezers. And after they fill their freezer, they're often done hunting for the season. But if you have an outlet like a program like this, that can serve as a motivation for hunters to continue hunting. If they know that those animals are going to be utilized, they're going to go to feed hungry people, then that can motivate hunters to stay in the field and harvest more deer. So this program is really great for that and incentivizing hunters to stay out there and keep hunting. It also serves as a way to utilize deer that are taken under deer damage permits or taken under circumstances where they're causing property damage and otherwise would not have been able to be utilized. Another incentive for the program is that hunters can get replacement antlerless deer permits for some of the zones out in eastern Massachusetts. So they harvest deer, then they get a new free antlerless deer permit to go ahead and try to harvest another. So just another really broad overview about the benefits of hunting. We know that deer hunting is effective at reducing deer densities. We know that it's practical, that it results in the immediate removal of deer from the landscape. It's safe for everyone, both hunters and non-hunters alike. It generates funding for all wildlife conservation efforts, land acquisition, and habitat management, and it feeds Massachusetts families and many people in need. But as confident as we are in the benefits of hunting, we need to remember what I mentioned before, that deer hunting or deer management is really complicated. And much of that complication is due to the challenges that we face today. So high deer abundance that continues to increase. We also are dealing with declining hunter participation. So back in the 80s, we had probably 100,000 or so participating hunters. Today, we're down to about 40,000 participating deer hunters. So we have fewer hunters over the years who are participating in the activity. We also have this major issue of declining hunter access. So lots of lands that are closed to hunting altogether. And then we have statute that prohibits the discharge of firearms and archery equipment, any hunting activity basically within 150 feet of a road, 500 feet of an occupied dwelling. So effectively, what we're needing to do is use a declining number of hunters to take an increasing number of deer, all while doing this with a declining amount of accessible huntable land, and doing all of that on an increasingly difficult legal landscape. So regulated hunting, it's only going to be effective where it's adequately applied and where there is open hunting access. So this map on the bottom left is depicting those discharge setbacks that I mentioned. So all of that area in red is basically area that's essentially closed to hunting access because of that statute that prohibits hunting within 500 feet of a dwelling. And so we know that about 60% of Massachusetts falls within these discharge setbacks, that one dwelling can result in as much as 18 acres that are then closed to hunting. And then in addition to these setbacks, we also have about 45% of municipalities, this is the map on the right, that have further restrictions for hunting. So hunting is already an extremely highly regulated activity. We have lots of rules, lots of regulations in place that highly control how people hunt, when people hunt, how many animals they can harvest, et cetera. But then we have all of these Massachusetts towns that add additional restrictions on top of that. So those are things like requiring written permission from the property owner, or no discharge at all. So they don't allow the discharge of a firearm or even archery equipment within town limits. So that functionally makes hunting impossible. So we know that we've got lots of deer habitat in these areas where people just cannot feasibly get in there and hunt, certainly can't do so legally. So this all comes down to the importance of access. And in order for hunting to be effective at reducing deer densities, hunters need access. And that doesn't just mean a property that allows hunting, it means literal access to the property. So ensuring that hunters can actually get to the property, find some place to park, and then get into the interior of the property. So ensuring that there's ample parking. I'm not talking about paved parking lots at these locations necessarily, but at least having pull-offs on the side of the road where a person can safely get their vehicle in, where a number of vehicles around the perimeter of the property can be parked. So you can get a number of hunters into those areas. For areas that are gated or have some road network through them that might not be public roads that are open, ensuring that hunters do have access and that they're able to get into the interior of these properties. So a great example is Quabbin Reservation. They've got controlled deer hunts that they carry out every year that have been wildly successful at bringing deer densities down to the goal and maintaining them there over time. And one of the ways that they do that is they open up their road networks that are typically gated and typically closed. They allow permitted hunters to get into the interior of the property so that they can adequately hunt and actually make a difference in terms of harvesting enough deer to keep them at their density goals. And then another aspect of access is not literal access, but really just an acceptance of hunting. So I think of, and a lot of these Eastern Mass especially, but elsewhere in the state too, where there just isn't a high tolerance or acceptance for hunting, it results in kind of a hostile environment for hunters. And we hear from hunters that they're hesitant to hunt on properties where they feel that they're excluded, where they're being discriminated against, where they're likely to be harassed when they're on those properties. And so just the fact that a community that is welcoming and other constituents using those properties who are accepting and welcoming of hunters can make a huge difference in terms of it being a place where hunters actually want to go and participate in the activity. Part of how we can work on that is just is having landowners and variety of land stewards. These are just a few examples of organizations across the Commonwealth that allow some level of hunting on their property. It's just a snippet. There are many more. But when these organizations and land stewards work together and collaborate, they can really make a difference, especially in terms of how they communicate about hunting with their constituents. So these landowners and organizations can and should continue to expand their collaborative efforts in support of deer management through regulated hunting. They can help support their counterparts by offering helpful suggestions in terms of what worked for their hunting programs, what didn't work, what are their success stories and failures, and basically just helping other organizations who might be interested in opening their properties to hunting about how they can avoid reinventing the wheel, right? Like this has been done on a lot of other properties. It's been successful on a lot of other properties. And so when all of these different land ownership organizations are working together, communicating, sharing ideas, it can make all the difference in terms of increasing hunting access and hunting opportunity, and just communicating effectively with a whole wide array of constituents about the importance of regulated hunting. With that, I'll leave you with a photo of what a nice healthy forest in central Massachusetts should look like. This is an example of a wildlife management area that's always been open to regulated deer hunting here in Massachusetts. And then just the last slide, if you have interest in Mass Wildlife's monthly newsletter, there's a QR code there for that on top. And then if you're interested in Mass Wildlife magazine subscription, you can use the QR code on the bottom. We do have an issue of the Mass Wildlife magazine here today with an article about deer management. We've got a couple of other handouts, one that I showed in a previous slide about communicating effectively about deer hunting. We've got our Living with Deer flyer, and we've got a flyer on the Hunters Share the Harvest program, and a couple other fun little things that Megan brought along. So with that, I will take questions, comments, anecdotes.
How people online can ask questions by just using the QR. Sorry, the Q&A.
Yep. Yep. So if you're online and you have questions or comments, use the Q&A box to put that in a chat, and Megan will be managing that. So she'll read off those questions to me, and then I can reiterate the question and then go ahead and answer from there. Yes.
You didn't mention anything about coyotes. I'm just wondering what you feel the impact they may have on it. Or
sure. So I did talk a little bit about the importance of deer mortality from natural predators, right? And I talked about adult deer mortality, but I didn't talk about fawn mortality. I talked about the fact that they have really high survival rates. But we do know that the primary form of fawn mortality is predation, and that's typically from coyotes, black bears, and bobcats. But what we also know from a number of studies that have been conducted throughout the Northeast is that those species do not have significant impacts on populations. So that's why we say those studies that I cited where there's 40 to 60% survival rates, they were looking at predation largely and other forms of mortality in fawns. So even with that predation from black bears, coyotes, and bobcat, you still have that really high survival rate. So do those predators affect deer? Yes, they consume deer fawns, absolutely. But do they have a negative impact on deer populations? No, not here in the Northeast. At least that's what the best available science tells us.
Where do they sleep in suburban areas?
So these suburban areas that provide such great habitat, it's because you have these little pockets of wooded areas and little pockets of natural habitat that sort of are ribboned throughout all of these developed landscapes. And that's really where they're kind of going to hole up, especially during the day. So they're going to consume large quantities of vegetation, and then as ruminants, they're going to bed down and they chew the cud, right? So they regurgitate everything that they've eaten and they re-chew it to get it broken down as much as possible so that they can extract as many nutrients as possible. So they're bedding down after they eat, and they're going to be using those little woodlots, those little pieces of vegetation, strips between like the medians and highways, things like that, they'll utilize for areas to bed down and to sleep and to rest and to digest. So
yeah, die eventually too. Those same areas. I've never seen a deer carcass.
Yeah, okay. Well, you haven't driven on 495 enough, apparently. But yeah, well, I mean, an important component to that too is how quickly our scavengers clean up carcasses as well. So we had a question about coyotes and how much they consume deer. They consume a lot of deer that die from other causes. So whether they've died from natural causes or deer vehicle collisions, coyotes do an incredible job of getting those cleaned up pretty quickly. And so oftentimes all you'll ever see are just kind of a scattering of bones from the animal, or maybe a piece of the hide. So it isn't terribly common to come across just a perfectly intact deer carcass from an animal that died of natural causes. If you do, it's because it just died, because they get cleaned up pretty quickly. Anyway, okay, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
How about consumption of the meat? Has there been any incidents of any problems with anything you can get from eating the meat from venison?
Not that I'm aware of, no. So venison is a really safe species, or deer is a real safe species of wildlife to consume. So there aren't the same concerns that there are for some other species. Like we hear some concerns about things like trichinosis with black bear and tularemia with rabbits and things like that. But no, there really aren't those same health concerns with deer. And that's why the Department of Public Health is as supportive of the Hunters Share the Harvest program, and largely why we're limited to donating deer only. So we do get those questions sometimes about like, well, why can't I donate my turkey or why can't I donate my deer? It largely comes down to the human health component of it, and deer, we just don't see those health concerns in terms of transmissible diseases that people are contracting from consuming venison. Yes. Sorry.
We all are looking for like partner organizations for the harvester program. But on Rotary, we do a lot of yoke packs and diversify our offerings.
Yeah, so if you're interested in opportunities to get more involved in the Hunter Share the Harvest program, then we suggest contacting our deer project leader, Martin Fian. So he has been working with increasing the number of participating processors, and he would be able to communicate where there might be some holes in the state that need to be filled, and working with getting those potential new processors on board as part of the program. So yeah, I would definitely reach out to Martin. You can find his contact information on our webpage, Martin Feehan, last name Feehan. And his contact information is probably on some of this info that we have here as well. But, yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Maybe you already answered this, but any uptick in maybe chronic wasting disease?
So we are monitoring annually for chronic wasting disease. So for anyone who's not already familiar, chronic wasting disease is an always fatal disease in deer species. It's a sort of an odd classification of diseases. It's very different from bacterial or viral diseases. It's called a spongiform encephalopathy. So it's a disease of the brain. And essentially what happens is that there is a protein that misfolds, and that misfolded protein becomes infectious, and deer are actively shedding those proteins, are called prions, into the environment. So they shed it through saliva, through blood, feces, urine, and other secretions. It's highly infectious, and those prions are spread throughout the environment, and they can persist in the environment for many years. So it's a very serious disease. It's very concerning, but thankfully we have not documented it here in Massachusetts. We are surveying for it each year during the hunting season. We go out and collect lymph nodes from a percentage of harvested deer and send those into the laboratory for testing. And so far we've not detected it here in Massachusetts. But nationally it is certainly spreading. And so we have lots of concerns about if and when it makes its way here to Massachusetts. It might only be a matter of time as natural deer movement, but more specifically, the real high risk is human behavior, particularly bringing in infectious material from other states that are positive. So we know that CWD has spread to other states largely because of folks bringing either live cervids, so the captive cervid facility is a major contributing factor. So whether it's deer farms that are producing venison or producing urine or other products, they're part of the issue. Another part of the issue is people moving deer parts. So after deer have been harvested in a CWD positive state, bringing infectious material like the whole carcass, spinal cord, brain tissue, nervous tissue back with them, and then leaving that in the environment can result in the spread of those infectious prions to deer that are utilizing the area. So the bigger concern is the human component in moving deer and deer parts. But realistically, one could say that, well, deer are naturally moving on the landscape too and crossing state borders. And so maybe it's only a matter of time before natural deer movement results in the disease making its way here to Massachusetts. Any questions online?
Yeah. I'll just say it verbatim. I understand that hunting on Sundays has passed and will be allowed in the future. Has there been any discussion on how this can affect the folks who like to hunt during the fall and their families, so affect them and their families? So maybe starting with that first one.
Yeah, so that first question about Sunday hunting. It has not passed at this point. So that is not a sure thing. We are still very much waiting for an update from the governor's office on where we sit with that. So very recently, we were asked by the governor's office to review a few different statutes that one prohibiting hunting on Sundays, Another that prohibits the use of crossbows for anyone who isn't specifically permitted to use them. And then those discharge setbacks that I was talking about in terms of how close you can hunt to roads and dwellings. And so we recently went through this exercise of having public listening sessions to gather public opinion on those 3 statutes and any potential change to those statutes. And so we gathered all of that public input, and we have shared that with the governor's office at this time. And now it's just kind of a waiting game to see where it goes from there. We had loosely anticipated that we might be getting some type of an update around March, but we don't have any dates on that. So just to clarify, Sunday hunting is still prohibited in Massachusetts, and those other 2 statutes, none of that has changed to date. But we're hopeful maybe hunting will become something that can another outdoor activity that can happen on Sundays, just like every other outdoor form of outdoor recreation. We're hopeful, but we'll see what comes of that. So the second part of the question was,
yeah, I can repeat that. Is has there been any discussions about, like, if Sundays were open to hunting, how that would affect people or families that like to hike during the fall season?
Yeah, so we had a lot of conversations about that internally, and certainly during all of those listening sessions, we heard from some members of the public, the non-hunting public, that were concerned about wanting to enjoy Sundays and wanting to be able to be outdoors without hunting happening. And so those concerns were definitely heard, but I'll just reiterate that hunting is an incredibly safe activity. We know that it happens concurrently with other forms of outdoor recreation across the Commonwealth every other day of the week, that it happens, that every other state other than Massachusetts and Maine like a full prohibition. Yeah. Right, that have a full prohibition on Sunday hunting. Hunting is happening on Sundays in all those other states without issue. So we really just aren't of the opinion that there's any significant risk. There's certainly not any risk to public safety. And so for anyone who is concerned that if Sunday hunting happens and you want to be able to go out and recreate, still there are lots and lots of properties here in Massachusetts that are closed and will remain closed to hunting even on Sundays. So you can explore those properties. And then I would point to that frequently asked questions webpage that we have. There's a whole section on there about how you can enjoy the outdoors safely, things that you can do to feel safer if you feel uncomfortable, if you are utilizing a property that is open to hunting. There's some great pointers there.
That's the only question on there.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah.
Do you have any information on the ratio of how many deer are harvested by, firearms versus bow hunting? And
yep.
Has that changed over time?
Yep, and it has. So archery hunting is definitely increasing in popularity, and it is more and more of our harvest is comprised of archery harvested deer each year. So it used to be that shotgun hunting was really the big take during the hunting season, and that's starting to diminish. Archery hunting is increasing more, and you can find all that information on our webpage. We have a whole webpage devoted to annual deer harvest. So we have documents that break out harvest by sex, harvest by management zone, harvest by implement, where you can look at those numbers in terms of how many deer are taken during each of the seasons, our archery season, shotgun season, and our muzzleloader season, and then how many are harvested by implement within those seasons. Cool. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So much people in person have gone down to that, and this is for the people online.